This free software I'm talking about today was created by Microsoft in 2004 and could auto-generate random music on a regular desktop PC. In a time before everything had AI and machine learning shoehorned into it, this would have been done by real algorithms, and I set out to take a peek behind the scenes and try to see how they could have done it. PhotoStory 3, released October 27, 2004, was created as an easy way to take digital photos and turn them into a slideshow, with motion, narration, text, and music capabilities, and was designed for use on Windows XP. I recently stumbled across some old files created using PhotoStory. Hearing the auto-generated music piqued my interest as to how it was created, because it didn't quite sound like a generic synthesized MIDI file to me. So, I set out to learn more about the feature. Looking around on the internet, I found little information about the program, and especially the music generation aspect. A review on a website from around the release date just mentions that it can do it and that it dynamically generates a soundtrack. Whereas today's Wikipedia page states that it has the capability to generate background music, but neither of those go into any amount of detail as to how it could be done. I wasn't able to find much past that. I did stumble across one forum post from someone who wanted to be able to accomplish this on Windows Vista, and when the replies confidently stated that the underlying technology was called Microsoft Music Composer, and that it was also present in PowerPoint. However, I couldn't find any mention of a related technology by this name, nor any signs of it having been present in any Office applications as far as I'm aware. With basic internet searching not getting me particularly far, I decided I'd need to dig in myself to find out meaningful info. At this point, I had the following points in mind. It required Windows XP or newer, and apparently worked even on Windows 10 with some tweaks. The music didn't seem to be simple MIDI to me. I could not find any other programs that had this functionality, so it seemed like it may have been specific to PhotoStory. The related functionality was likely proprietary, and likely not in a format that could be read by other software, making this potentially quite difficult. However, it was simple enough to fit into a few megabyte application and run on regular household computers, so it couldn't do anything that fancy. So, obviously, the next step was to get Windows XP in a virtual machine up and running, and just start poking around. I made a new Hyper-V VM on my host, gave it plenty of resources, and set it off to install. I expected this would be super fast, as installing Windows 10 on a VM in here takes 2 to 3 minutes. But it actually ended up taking over 30. I guess they wanted to make sure that time estimate was accurate one way or another. As one would expect, installing a 20-year-old operating system on a brand new machine, there were a few hiccups along the way. First off, mouse input didn't work. Turns out I needed to install the Hyper-V guest integration tools manually, and after a bit of remembering how to navigate everything via keyboard, I was able to get this installed and got a working mouse. Next up, changing the screen resolution to something more usable. This only took a lot of graphic glitches and one hard lockup requiring a reboot, and then I got a good resolution dialed in. Next up, I needed some software. Accessing my SMB3 only file server wasn't going to work on XP, so I got the network adapter up and headed over to one of my favorite sites, Ninite. However, their installer understandably errored out, telling me that I'm stuck a little too far in the past. I shut down, grabbed a copy of the latest compatible Firefox installer and a copy of the PhotoStory installer, and just put them directly in the VHDX. Booting back up, Firefox installed without drama, but PhotoStory wanted Windows Media Player 10 first. So I went back, grabbed that installer, put it on the disk, and installed it. Worked perfectly, and PhotoStory installed afterwards with no issues. Alright, time to launch it. Everything was going smoothly. I selected some pictures, clicked next, skipped adding titles, and then got an error that I had no microphone. That's fine, I don't want narration anyways, so I moved on. And there it was, the fabled Create Music button. However, my hopes were quickly dashed by the absence of a sound cart, preventing it from working. Obviously, a virtual machine wouldn't have a sound device, especially on a server, so I decided to try what I knew would work on modern Windows, RDP. My initial connection attempt didn't work, as it would only allow me to sign in remotely if the administrator account had a password. Easy enough, I put a password on it and voila, we were in. And it appeared that the sound was working too. Ah, that beautiful ding noise. I opened Photo Story back up, and this time the Create Music button opened the menu I was looking for. I chose some options and hit play. Okay, so that's not quite what I was looking for. Clearly, a modern remote desktop wasn't well optimized for streaming audio from XP. It juddered, stuttered, and did all kinds of horrible things, but at least it was working. Further attempts yielded pretty much the same results, so I gave up on the preview. I decided to just press on and export the video to get non-laggy audio. However, while it was generating my music, I noticed little snippets of instruments were coming through the speakers. This, combined with the very generic sounding percussion in the preview I had chosen, made me pretty sure it actually was MIDI. And during this generating phase, it was literally just playing the music back to itself as a means of recording, which was also evidenced by it taking pretty much the same amount of time as the video length across several different project lengths. Sadly, this also meant that the same RDP latency issues plagued the output videos. Clearly, I needed a better solution. The latency was odd, as I was on a wired 10 gigabit LAN link to the server, so it shouldn't be anywhere near this bad. I looked around in the audio settings and RD client settings, but found nothing helpful. Also, the way that the latency manifested sounded very much like delayed MIDI commands rather than wave buffer overruns, so this gave me even more confidence that this system was actually MIDI-based under the hood. For now, I just shelved the issue and moved on to inspecting the project file. PhotoStory saves its project into WP3 files, and it was some kind of binary format. After a few seconds of inspecting it, I noticed the presence of multiple file names, and an overall pattern that reminded me of an archive file. My first instinct was to just rename it to a .zip, and that is indeed what it was. Opening it up, I was greeted by the pictures I had imported and a project.xml file. I quickly found the music section with a DMusic entry. I assumed this was dynamic music or something similar, and noticed two properties that appeared to be file names, but with extensions I did not recognize. The rest of the file didn't look particularly interesting. Jumping back into the VM, my first instinct was to search for one of these files, and it didn't take long to find it in the most obvious location possible: C, Program Files, PhotoStory 3 for Windows, and in there a subfolder called DM Content. DM? I guess that's probably dynamic music. I browsed around the other files for a while, looked through any interesting looking DLLs with Resource Hacker, and I didn't find much interesting info, except this large XML file embedded in dmcontentui.dll. I exported it for later investigation. It clearly defined what each of the genres, styles, and bands were, and once again I saw those CDM, STY, and AUD files. Something interesting I noted was that all of the CDM and STY files were in 8.3 name format, whereas the AUP files weren't. Perhaps those were reused from an older project. I set out to figure out what these files were. Opening them in a hex editor, the RIFF header immediately stood out. This was a common and very versatile media format, and it meant I could inspect it later in a purpose-designed viewer. However, I started by just scanning through the file manually, noting that sections have very repetitive data. This further solidified my intuition that it was MIDI related, as actual wave data would not look quite like this. I quickly looked at the other two file types, and they were also RIFF encoded. It was time to grab a copy of RIFF-pad and dig in. There was clearly quite a bit going on in this file, and the 4-character limitation on section names wasn't exactly helping me understand what the structure was. I grabbed one of the names, just a random one, PCSL, and searched online for the combination of RIFF and PCSL. I found a C header file, DMusicF.h, which was labeled Direct Music File Formats. Aha! Looks like we stumbled into another direct. Windows has a good few of them, and this is one I wasn't yet familiar with. Now I also knew the origin of the term DMusic. It wasn't dynamic, but direct. Reading the Wikipedia page, I also found that the DMO from earlier meant DirectX Media Object. We were clearly dealing with a more general system here, not something specific to PhotoStory. This was both somewhat disappointing, as it meant there was a lot less to explore, but also relieving, as it meant I wasn't about to spend countless hours in a disassembler reverse engineering algorithms. Looking back on it, it also made a lot more business sense. Why would Microsoft want to spend so many engineering hours designing a custom system to generate music, just as a bullet point feature in a free product that would be used by some home users? Reading through the list of cool features, we arrive at this line. Looks like I'll be getting myself a copy of Direct Music Producer. I found it very easily on archive.org, and while doing a bit more browsing around, I quickly got the impression that this wasn't the most well-designed piece of software, with users saying things like, DMP is notoriously difficult to learn. Some more evidence I found, here's an overview of the README it popped up during installation. The things that are unintuitive section is concerningly large compared to other content, but luckily I'm just here to poke around, not to actually make anything. Direct Music Producer installed with no issue and booted right up. The UI looked interesting. The amount of vertical space used here rivals the days of Internet Explorer toolbars. Whatever, let's just see what it does when I drag in one of the files from PhotoStory. I'm starting here with a style definition, or an STY file. It loaded right up with no issue and presented a bunch of stuff I don't understand. Playback is also just as bad as in PhotoStory, so I'll spare you the audio here. Haha, just kidding, here you go. Looking at the band definitions, it appears this 2D graph shows the different possible instruments plotted by pan, left-right, and relative volume, up-down, just like a real band. This was clearly put together by people following quite old UI practices, with functionality hidden away in submenus of menus and dialog boxes triggered by small buttons in specific locations. But I'm getting the impression that there's actually quite a lot going on here. Next up, I tried the corresponding CDM file, which is apparently a chord map. It also opened right up and showed me a nice piano roll and a grid of options that I never did figure out what they do. Next up, an AUP or audio path file. Once again, it opened easily and showed me a bunch of info I don't understand. This view here also goes with the very well-known and intuitive UI practice of putting a horizontal list of clickable items in a row inside a table view list. I didn't even know that was possible until now. At the very least, it did manage to crash only once in the 20 minutes or so I spent fiddling around with it. Doing some more research, I found a website that had a copy of the ancient MSDN documentation for Direct Music, explaining what each of the different parts of the system do. It's quite fascinating, and I recommend giving it a read if you're curious. Link in the description. Having satisfied my curiosity of what these files were, and how they made music, I wanted to get PhotoStory to generate some usable sound to demonstrate the technology. RDP clearly wasn't cutting it, and there was no Hyper-V or physical audio device to use. So I settled on the best thing I could think of, virtual audio cable. This created a virtual audio device on the driver level inside the VM, hopefully removing any kind of latency problem. However, we'll take a quick detour into the XP audio settings where I found this as an audio device type. Apparently they put speakers in desktop keyboards at some point. Interesting. Anyways, I got virtual audio cable set up, remembered to stop using RDP as it overrides local audio devices, and jumped back into PhotoStory to try generating some music again. This time it worked perfectly. The output was very smooth with no noticeable issues whatsoever. I simply needed to use RDP to preview it with stutter, then switch back to the local console to use virtual audio cable to export smoothly. I did this for a variety of different settings to see what it would make. Before I let the audio samples play out, I just wanted to mention that I installed a copy of Office 2003. Looking around in PowerPoint, I couldn't find anything resembling this create music functionality. Oh, and I also stopped by to check out the first version of OneNote 2, one of my favorite and most used programs in modern versions. It was very different back then. I also played a quick game of Pinball, absolute classic. Overall, this project ended up taking quite a turn from what I expected, but I'm quite happy with what I was able to find and do. Direct music seemed to be used mostly only by games of the late 90s and early 2000s, but I wasn't familiar with it until now. From what I've seen and read about it, it actually sounds like a really cool technology, and I do wonder what it would be like in the modern day if it continued to evolve and advance over time. Sadly, the version we explored here from DirectX 9 appears to be the last update of any significance, and the technology has been slowly fading away since. Bummer. Thanks for checking out the video. I hope you learned something, and here's some more of the generated audio. I think it really shines when emulating classical music.